thought about what I would say to her, the woman I was before all of this. I've imagined finding her on that Tuesday morning in late October, standing barefoot on the back porch of our house by the lake, watching the fog come off the water the way it always did in autumn, slow and low and patient, like something that had been waiting all night for permission to move. I've imagined tapping her on the shoulder and saying, "Look at the fog. Really look. Because in 8 months, you won't be able to see this view without feeling it in your chest like a bruise." But I've decided I wouldn't say a word. Not because it wouldn't have helped. Maybe it would have. Maybe she could have protected herself sooner, gathered her documents, made her phone calls, prepared the quiet architecture of her exit before any of it became necessary. But she needed to find out the way she found out. She needed the name she saw on a phone screen while he was in the shower. A name she told herself meant nothing. She needed the phone bill folded inside a fishing magazine, the one she almost threw away without opening. She needed the silence that stretched across the dinner table on the night of their 19th anniversary, 4 seconds too long. She counted them later. She actually counted them when she asked him if he still felt lucky. And he smiled the smile she'd spent 2 decades believing in and said, "Of course." She needed every single one of those things to become who I am now. And I think even now she would have trusted him anyway. Because that's who she was. That's who I was. Her name was Mara Voss. She was 44 years old that October, which surprised her every time she thought about it. Not because 44 felt old, but because she had been 26 when she met Daniel. And the math between those two numbers still didn't feel real to her. 18 years. 19, if you counted the year they dated before the wedding. She had been so young when she loved him first. Young enough that loving him had felt like weather rather than choice. Something that simply arrived and settled over her life and rearranged everything without asking. She was a landscape restorer by profession, which was a title most people found unusual until she explained it. And sometimes, even after. She worked with parks departments and private landowners to bring back native ecosystems that had been damaged or erased wetlands, coastal meadows, riparian corridors, places where the original species of a place had been slowly crowded out by something invasive that looked, from a distance, a lot like it belonged there. She spent her days in waders and field boots, taking soil samples and seed counts and writing reports that most of her clients never fully read. She loved the work, with a steadiness that had never required explanation. The land didn't ask anything of her she wasn't prepared to give. They lived in a house called the Lake House. Though it wasn't a vacation home, it was their actual home. A 100-year-old converted farmhouse on the western shore of Harrow Lake in a small town called Elstow. 3 hours north of the city where Daniel ran his architectural firm. He drove down on Monday mornings and returned Thursday nights. Mara had arranged her fieldwork to fit that pattern without ever pointing out that she'd done it. There was a school 20 minutes away for their daughter, Perry, who was 15 that year and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of going quiet before she said anything important. The commute was hard on Daniel. Mara knew that. She had always known that. She had made things easier for him, quietly, in the way she made most things easier for most people without announcement, without ledger. She had a habit that anyone paying close attention would have noticed, every time she finished a conversation with Daniel on the phone. At the door. After dinner, she waited. Just a beat. A small involuntary pause before she moved on to the next thing. As if she were listening for something. As if she had learned. A long time ago, that a conversation wasn't actually over until she'd confirmed that the ground was still solid beneath it. She never told him about that habit. She barely told herself. The symbolic object in this story is a glass jar. A wide-mouthed mason jar that sat on the windowsill of Mara's home office, filled with small stones she'd collected from different project sites over the years. A gray piece of granite from the Harrow Lake restoration. A piece of pale limestone from a prairie in Nebraska. A smooth black river stone from a creek bed in Oregon. She added to the collection slowly, one stone at a time, from places that had come back, from land that had healed. She didn't think of the jar as meaningful. It was just there. It had always been just there. I can tell you now, she picked up that jar at the very end. And it was heavier than she expected. Not the stones. The stones hadn't changed. The first sign was not the phone. That's what she told me, what I tell myself when I think back to that October. The first sign was earlier, much earlier. The first sign was a change in the quality of his attention. Daniel had always been a man who noticed things. He noticed when Perry's haircut was new. He noticed when Mara had moved a piece of furniture even slightly. He noticed the exact moment a dinner party conversation shifted from interesting to performative. And he had this way of catching Mara's eye across the table when it happened, a look that meant you too, a private language they'd been speaking for 19 years. She had treasured that look. It had made her feel, reliably, that she was not alone in any room she stood in. Sometime in the spring before that October-April, she thought, though she couldn't be certain, the look stopped. Not suddenly, not in a way you could point to and say, there, that was the moment. It was a gradual dimming, like the light changing in a season. One week the look was there, another week. When she caught his eye across a table at the Burke's dinner party, there was a second of blankness before he smiled, as if he'd needed a moment to locate himself. She put it down to stress. The firm had a difficult commission that spring, a civic center in a town where the planning committee had strong opinions. He was tired. She understood tired. She had spent most of their marriage understanding tired. She did not say anything. That was the architecture of her love, the things she understood without being asked. By July, the dimming had extended to mornings. Daniel had always woken before her, an early riser, a coffee drinker, a man who used the first hour of the day to read and think before the world asked anything of him. Mara would come downstairs to find him already at the kitchen table, and he would look up at her, and there had always been something in that look that said, "Here you are." A small gladness at her appearance in his morning. She had never been able to explain, to anyone who asked, why she loved him, without eventually landing on that the way he looked up when she came into a room. Not with surprise, with arrival. In July, he began looking up from his phone. The first time, she noticed the angle of his wrist, the subtle shift of his hand. Not quite hiding the screen, but redirecting it. She told herself she'd imagined it. She told herself he was probably reading about the planning committee. She told herself that people had things on their phones that were private, and that privacy was not the same as secrecy, and that she, of all people, should know the difference. She was a person who protected people. She had been doing it her entire life. Her mother had been sick for most of Mara's 20s, and Mara had managed the illness quietly, the appointments, the insurance paperwork, the conversations with her younger brother that filtered the worst parts of the news into something he could carry without being crushed by it. She had done all of this while also starting her career, while also falling in love with Daniel, while also becoming the kind of person she wanted to be. No one had known how much she was carrying. She had made sure of that. The false belief she carried, the one she had never examined closely enough to name, was this: love does not need to be witnessed. Silence is enough. If you give everything quietly, it counts the same as if you gave it loudly. Maybe more. She had been operating on that belief for so long, it had become her posture. The slight forward lean, the readiness to absorb. The name she saw on the phone screen was Sylvie. She didn't see it on purpose. He had left his phone on the kitchen counter. On a Wednesday morning, this was the 3rd week of October, and she was reaching past it for her coffee mug, and the screen lit up with a message. And the name was there before she could look away. Just the name, no surname, no content of the message, just Sylvie. And below it, a small preview she couldn't read from that angle. Her hand closed around the mug. She stood with the mug in her hand and the phone on the counter between them, and she listened to the sound of the shower running upstairs, and she thought, clearly and precisely, as if she were taking a soil reading, this might mean nothing. And then she thought, but I have been watching something change for 6 months. She did not pick up the phone. She did not check the message. She went to the back porch with her coffee and watched the fog come off the lake, and she waited until she heard the shower stop and the pipes go quiet. He came down 10 minutes later. He kissed her on the cheek. She felt his lips, the familiar warmth, and she said, "Good morning." And he said, "Good morning. How'd you sleep?" And she said, "Fine." And she handed him his coffee without being asked, because she always knew how he took it, and she always had it ready. And he smiled the smile she had spent 2 decades believing in, and picked up his phone from the counter and scrolled to whatever he was looking for with the ease of a man who was not worried. He went to the city that Monday. He returned Thursday. Mara spent the week working a wetland restoration project 20 minutes north of Elstow. And she drove to the site each morning and walked the transects and took her measurements and wrote in her field notebook with the methodical attention that her work required. And at night, she sat at the kitchen table while Perry did homework across from her. And she thought about 6 months, and a name, and the way a look could dim like light. She did not say anything to anyone. This is what I mean when I say she was me. This is the part I understand most completely, and the part I find hardest to forgive in her. She was sitting on evidence, and she was protecting everyone from it. And she was calling that love. The phone bill was in the 3rd week of November. Daniel had a habit of keeping his fishing magazines in a basket near the back door he fished the lake when he was home on weekends. Early mornings, before Perry woke up. It was one of the things Mara had always liked about him, the way the lake made him simple. On land, in the city, he was a man of plans and presentations and professional armor. By the water at 5:30 in the morning, he was just a man holding a rod and watching the surface of things. She had sometimes stood at the kitchen window and watched him fish without his knowing, and she had felt, watching, that she was seeing the version of him nobody else got to see. The magazine basket needed emptying. The recycling day was Thursday. She gathered the stack 3 Field and Stream issues, a catalog, and the folded paper fell out from between the 2nd and 3rd magazine, and she caught it without thinking. The reflexive catch of a person who has handled paper their whole life. It was a phone bill, his personal account, not the family plan, not the firm's account, an account she hadn't known existed. She stood in the back hallway holding the paper and the recycling basket, and she heard herself exhale, a slow, controlled breath. The kind she used when she was measuring something she needed to be precise about. She set the recycling basket down. She unfolded the bill. The call log was 4 pages. She didn't count the calls to the number she didn't recognize at first. She counted them later. Sitting in her car in the driveway with the engine off, in the blue-gray dark of a November afternoon. 47 calls over 3 months. Average duration 22 minutes. The longest call, 1 hour and 4 minutes. A Tuesday. The Tuesday of the week they had driven Perry to a regional debate tournament in the city and stayed over. The 3 of them, in a hotel near the school, and Daniel had said he needed to step out for a walk to clear his head. And Mara had said, "Of course, go. I'll stay with Perry." She had stayed with Perry. She had waited up for him in the hotel room, with the television on at low volume and a book open in her lap that she hadn't been reading. And he'd returned an hour later saying the air had helped, and she'd said good, and she'd turned off the television and gotten into bed, and he'd put his arm around her in the dark, and she had lain there feeling, without being able to name it, that something was being maintained. Not created, maintained. As if the warmth between them had become a performance they were both committed to without having agreed. Now she knew what he had been doing with that hour. I need to pause here for my present, looking back at hers, and tell you that what happened next was not screaming. It was not confrontation. It was not tears in the driveway. That's what I wish she had done. Some part of me still wishes she had walked into the house and put the phone bill on the kitchen table and said, "Explain this." But she didn't. She folded the bill carefully along its original creases, and she put it in her coat pocket, and she went inside, and she made dinner, and she helped Perry with her history paper, and she watched Daniel eat the meal she'd prepared, and she noticed, for the first time, that he ate with the focused efficiency of a man whose mind was elsewhere. And she thought, how long have I been the only one at this table? She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark beside him and listened to him breathe and thought about soil that had been slowly colonized by something that looked, from a distance, a lot like it belonged there. Her private investigation began the next morning. She was systematic. She had always been systematic. In her work, good data meant the difference between a restoration project that succeeded and one that collapsed under the weight of its own early optimism. You did not commit resources to a site until you understood the full extent of the damage. You did not tell yourself the problem was smaller than it was. She started with what she had, a name and a phone number. She reverse searched the number on her lunch break, sitting in her truck on the shoulder of the access road to the wetland site. The search returned a business name, Sylvie Martel, Architectural Photography. The website was clean and professional, a portfolio of buildings, mostly civic and commercial work, the kind Daniel's firm specialized in. Beautiful photographs, long shadows, concrete textures, light caught in the geometry of structures. In the About section, there was a photograph of Sylvie Martel herself, a woman in her mid-30s with short dark hair and an expression that was both confident and privately amused, as if she found the world generally interesting. She was the kind of woman who photographed well. She probably knew that. Mara stared at the photograph for a long time. She was not feeling what she had expected to feel. She had expected rage, or at least the clean, clarifying heat of it. What she felt instead was something quieter and stranger, a sadness that had no specific target, as if the grief was too large to direct at anyone in particular, and had simply spread out to fill the available space, like water on a flat surface. She asked herself how long the phone bill covered 3 months, but she understood enough about ecosystems to know that 3 months of documentation did not mean 3 months of existence. You found the evidence when you found it. The reality preceded the evidence by an unknown interval. She went back to the house that evening and went to Daniel's study, his home office, the room she never entered without a reason, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. It was a sparse, well-ordered room, a drafting table, a desk, a bookshelf lined with architecture theory and local history books he collected with a mild devotion. On the drafting table, a current project. She looked at it for a moment. A residential extension, a house being added to, and then she went to the desk drawer. She found nothing incriminating in the desk drawer. What she found was a receipt from a restaurant in the city, a good restaurant. Not the kind they went to for business lunches, dated 8 months ago, for 2. She turned the receipt over. On the back, in his handwriting, a time, 7:45. Don't be late. Below that, bring the Harrow Lake photos. Mara looked at the receipt for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea and sat with the mug in both hands and thought about the Harrow Lake restoration project. Her project, the one she'd been working for 3 years. The one that had made a small reputation for her in her field. The one Daniel had always said he was proud of. He'd come to the site twice, before she got deep into the field work. He'd taken photographs. Not many, maybe a dozen, on his phone, and she'd thought nothing of it, because he liked to document things, and because the lake was beautiful, and because she'd assumed the photographs were for him. She had never asked him what he'd done with the photographs. She made herself think through it slowly, the way she thought through a site assessment. If he had given her photographs to Sylvie Martel, photographs of her project, her lake, her work, what did that mean? It might mean nothing. A photographer might be interested in landscape. A photographer who worked in architecture might be looking for contrast, for context, for natural forms adjacent to built ones. But the receipt was 8 months ago. The dinner was 8 months ago. The dimming of his attention had begun in April, which was 8 months ago. She went to bed before he called. He called every night when he was in the city, a habit, a ritual, a thing she had always counted on without examining it. The phone rang at 10:15, and she answered it, and they talked for 11 minutes about Perry's debate tournament results and a problem with the boiler and the neighbor's dog that had been loose in the yard. He said, I miss the lake. She said, the lake misses you. She said it automatically. The way she said things she had said so many times they had become reflexive. She hung up and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she began keeping records. She was careful. She had spent her career being careful. She bought a new notebook, not the kind she used for field work, but a plain, unlined journal from the stationery shop in Elstow, and she kept it in the pocket of her field bag, which Daniel never touched. Each evening, she wrote down the day's date, any call from Daniel, any interaction, any detail that struck her as significant. She wrote in the measured language of a field report, observations, not interpretations, facts, not conclusions. She was aware that she was protecting herself, and she was aware that she found this shameful. And she wrote that down too. November 27th. It shames me that I'm doing this. I'm not sure if the shame is about distrusting him or about how long it took me to start. She also began working backward. She had always been the keeper of their shared administrative life. The files, the tax documents, the insurance, the memberships. He trusted her with the logistics in the same way he trusted her with the logistics of everything else, fully and without examination. She went through the joint bank records for the past 2 years. She was looking for the kind of purchases that announced a different life: restaurant dinners, hotel stays, flower deliveries. She found fewer of those than she expected. He was careful, or he was using cash, or the card she didn't have access to. What she found instead was a pattern of weekend absences. Not many, 7 in 2 years. He had told her, each time, that he was working a client site visit, a project review, a favor for a colleague. She had never questioned it. She had used those weekends to take Perry to her grandmother's, or to work on her field data, or to have the kind of long, solitary Saturdays she had always needed and never particularly wanted to admit to needing. She had trusted him with his time and his explanations. She counted the weekends in the notebook. 7. She tried to remember if she had felt anything odd during those weekends, and she could recall, now, a low-grade unease she had attributed to the loneliness of an empty house, or to fatigue, or to nothing in particular. She had been so skilled at attributing her unease to nothing in particular. One of those weekends was the September before last. Perry had been at her grandmother's. Mara had been at a conference in Portland for 3 days. Daniel had said he'd be at the office. She called him from Portland. Twice. Both times he answered and sounded present and normal and mildly harassed about the planning committee. She had been in Portland. She had been the one away from home. She thought about that for a long time. This is the part that I find hardest to write, even now. Not the facts of what she discovered those became, in time, a kind of dark geography she learned to navigate. The hardest part is this: she had been so good at being invisible in her own marriage. Not invisible to Daniel, he had always seen her, or she'd believed he had. Invisible in the sense that her giving went unremarked. She fixed things without mentioning them. She adjusted without announcing it. She reduced her own needs to a size that could be accommodated without disruption, and she did this so consistently that she had eventually lost track of what her actual needs were. She had built the architecture of her marriage on silence, and she had told herself it was sacrifice, and she had told herself that sacrifice was love. She had been wrong. Not about the love. About what love required. In early December, she drove to the city. She told Daniel she had a meeting with the funding body, True. She did have that meeting. In the morning. She told Perry she'd be back by dinner. She was between the meeting and dinner. She spent 3 hours at the public library, because the library had records access and because she trusted herself more in a library than in a browser search that left a history. She looked up Sylvie Martel's professional history. She looked up Daniel's firm. She found 3 projects, spanning 4 years, where Sylvie Martel was credited as the photographer. The first project was dated 4 years ago. 4 years. She sat with that number. 4 years ago. Perry was 11. 4 years ago. Mara had been finishing the first phase of the Harrow Lake restoration. 4 years ago. Daniel had come home from the city one Friday evening with a bottle of very good wine and said, "I want to celebrate something. Not anything specific, just us." And she had been so moved by that, by the specificity of his love, by the way he noticed things that she had cried a little, which she almost never did. And he had held her face in his hands and said, "Why are you crying?" And she had said, "Because I love you." And she had meant it with everything she had. She had been crying with someone she'd already been betrayed by for at least some portion of 1 year. She didn't cry in the library. She wrote in her notebook Project 1 4 years ago, Project 2 2.5 years ago, Project 3 last year. 47 calls in 3 months. She underlined the number 4. She didn't know why. Then she closed the notebook and took a breath and went to get her car. On the drive home, she crossed the bridge over Harrow River, and the river was running high from autumn rain, fast and brown and purposeful. And she thought the land always tells you what's in it. You just have to know how to read the signs. She had been reading the wrong signs, or she had been reading the right signs and choosing not to record them. She had one more question. She had been trying not to ask it because it felt like the question that would change everything, not the fact of it, but her standing in relation to her own life once she'd answered it. The question was not, who is she? She knew who she was. The question was, does he love her? She thought she already knew the answer to that, too. The answer arrived from an unexpected direction in mid-December. Elstow hosted its annual winter market, a small, earnest event on the main street with stalls selling handmade things and mulled cider and the kind of baked goods that tasted better in cold air. Mara went with Perry on a Saturday afternoon while Daniel was at the office, or said he was at the office, and she noted this notation. Private, with the mild nausea that had become her constant companion since November. They walked the stalls and drank cider, and Perry bought a scarf. And Mara ran into Eleanor Birch. Eleanor Birch was 67 years old and had lived in Elstow since before anyone currently living there could remember. She had been a school teacher for 30 years and was now retired and occupied herself with the lake. Not in Mara's professional sense, Eleanor simply loved the lake. She walked it daily, in all weather. She knew its moods. She kept a small journal of the bird sightings on its shore and had been doing so for 20 years. She was also, Mara had always found, a person who noticed things. They stopped at the edge of the market and talked for a few minutes about the restoration project, about the winter weather, about Perry's debate results. Then Eleanor said, carefully, in the way of a person choosing their words, "I've been seeing lights at your place, on the nights you're at your mother's. Early mornings, sometimes." Mara looked at her. Eleanor held her gaze. "I walk the South Shore at sunrise. Your house is visible from the path. I don't want to presume." A pause. "I just thought you might want to know," Mara said. "When did you start noticing?" Eleanor thought about it. 2 summers ago, she said. 2 summers ago. Perry came back with the scarf and a gingerbread reindeer, and they said goodbye to Eleanor and walked back to the car. And Perry talked about the scarf, and Mara listened and answered at the correct intervals and felt the information settling into her like cold water finding its level. 2 summers ago. 4 years of professional proximity. 47 calls in 3 months. 7 weekend absences. 1 phone bill folded inside a fishing magazine. 1 receipt with a time written on the back in his handwriting. She had enough. The question was what to do with it. She did not confront him, not yet. That surprised her. Later. She had always assumed she would be the kind of person who confronted, who demanded, who cleared the table with 1 clean action and made everyone look at what was underneath. Instead, she went home and made dinner and put Perry to bed and sat in her office with the mason jar of lake stones on the windowsill, and she thought about the difference between having the truth and knowing what you want to do with it. She had spent her professional life restoring damaged land. She knew, from experience, that the first impulse in a restoration, the instinct to immediately remove the invasive species, to clear the damage in one dramatic action, was almost always the wrong one. If you moved too fast, you disrupted the remaining structure, you caused erosion, you opened the soil to new damage before the native species were strong enough to hold it. Sometimes you had to stabilize first, quietly, before you decided what to take out. She thought about Perry, about the way Perry said "dad" with a particular softness, the syllable carrying all 15 years of her relationship with him, the weekend fishing, the city trips, the inside jokes, the specific shorthand of a father-daughter pair. She thought about what it would mean to Perry to have that word change meaning. She thought about herself at 15. She thought about her mother's illness. She thought about all the ways she had been protected from the truth because someone who loved her had decided the truth was more than she could carry. She thought maybe the truth is always more than we can carry. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. She opened the notebook. She wrote, December 16th. I know. I have known. I think. Since July. What I don't have is all of it. I need all of it. Not for the confrontation, for myself. Because I need to know the shape of what happened in order to know the shape of what I was living in. She paused. She wrote, Also, I think he was afraid of something. I don't know what yet. I need to know that, too. This was the first sign of what she was becoming. January was cold. The lake froze in the first week fully, which it hadn't done in 3 years. Mara found herself going to the shore every morning before Perry's school run, standing at the edge of the ice and listening to it. Ice sounds like something alive. It pops and groans and shifts, even when it looks completely still. You could stand above a frozen lake and feel sure of the solidity, and hear, below you, the sounds of a thing that was still in motion. She had begun calling her sister in the evenings. Clara lived in Boston, was unmarried, and had always been the person Mara called when she needed to think out loud without being fixed. She didn't tell Clara everything. She didn't say, I believe my husband has been in a 4-year affair and I've been documenting it for 6 weeks. She said I'm going through something. I'm not ready to talk about it, but I need someone to know I'm going through something. Clara said, I know. I've been able to hear it in your voice for months. Mara said, Why didn't you say anything? Clara said, Because you would have said you were fine. Mara sat with that. It was true. She began, slowly and very quietly, to prepare. She opened her own bank account, a personal account, at a bank they didn't use. She didn't move money into it, she simply opened it, the way you might mark an exit on a map before you've decided whether you're leaving. She spoke to her accountant, Len Ferris, who was a direct man she'd used for 12 years and whom she trusted, and she asked him to walk her through the financial structure of their joint assets without giving any particular reason. Len walked her through it. He didn't ask questions. Afterward, she thought he knew, too. She also did something she had not expected to do. She started writing down the things she had given, not bitterly, not as a list of grievances, as a record. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings while Daniel was in the city, and she wrote in the notebook the conference he hadn't been able to attend because her mother was in the hospital and someone had to be home with Perry. And she had gone to the hospital and he had gone to the conference. The years she had shaped her fieldwork schedule around his commute without mentioning that she'd done it. The grant application she hadn't submitted because the research period overlapped with his firm's biggest project launch, and she had known, without discussing it, that she needed to be fully present at home. The way she had arranged every holiday, every social event, every household repair, not because he was incapable, but because she was efficient and he was busy, and she had never wanted to be the kind of wife who made her labor visible. The list ran to 11 pages. I am not writing that to make Daniel a villain. He was not a villain. That is what I understand now that she didn't understand then, that what was happening between them was the erosion of a man who had been afraid of something for a very long time, and the silence of a woman who had been protecting everyone from everything, and the collision of those two architectures. Two buildings built on the same flawed foundation. Sooner or later, the soil beneath them was always going to shift. But I'm also writing it because she deserved to see it. She had never once looked at the full shape of what she'd given, and she needed to. Not because it would change what had happened, because she needed to know herself clearly in order to decide what she wanted next. In the third week of January, she found the photographs. She found them by accident. She was looking for a water damage claim form in the filing cabinet in Daniel's study he had asked her to look for, which was its own painful irony. And in the folder behind the insurance documents, she found a printed photograph, landscape format, 8 by 10. It was Harrow Lake. Specifically, it was Harrow Lake at dawn in early summer, shot from the south shore from Eleanor Birch's walking path. The light was extraordinary, gold and low and slant, catching the mist off the water and the new reeds along the restored corridor. It was the section Mara had spent 2 years rehabilitating. You could see, in the photograph, the exact boundary where the native sedges began the line between what had been damaged and what had come back. In the lower right corner, a small copyright mark. S. Martel. Sylvie Martel had been to their lake, not just to the city, not just to Daniel's firm. She had been here, to Elstow, to the south shore of Harrow Lake. And she had photographed Mara's restoration project, and someone Daniel, she could only assume, had printed the photograph and kept it in a folder in his filing cabinet behind the insurance documents. Mara held the photograph and felt something she hadn't felt yet in all of this. A specific, located anger. Not a general grief or a diffuse sadness. Anger. Because the lake was hers. Not in the legal sense the lake belonged to the township, to the ecology, to itself. But in the sense that matters more than legal, she had put herself into that lake. She had spent 2 years in its soil and its water. She had restored it with her own hands, and it had been used, her work, her place, her most private proof that she was good at something, as a backdrop for someone else's story. She put the photograph back. She took a photograph of it with her phone. She filed it in the folder she had created on her phone, a folder she had titled, with the dry precision of her field reports, Documentation. That folder now had 43 items. It was early February when she found out about the shared wound. She found it the way she found most things, carefully, systematically, by being willing to look at information she wasn't sure she wanted. She had been reading through some old emails, a folder of correspondence she'd been organizing, partly as a task and partly as an avoidance of something else. And she found an exchange from 6 years ago, between Daniel and his brother, Marcus. Marcus lived in Vancouver, and they were not close. They called at Christmas and spoke in the broad, diplomatic language of brothers who had grown up in the same house and reached different conclusions about what they'd found there. The email exchange was about their father's death. It had happened that year, and Mara had been present for the grief of it, had held Daniel through it, had arranged most of the logistics. She remembered the year as a hard one, a year of Daniel being quieter than usual, more careful with her, more prone to long absences into himself that she had always respected without question. She read the emails now with different eyes. In one of them, Daniel wrote to Marcus, "I keep thinking about what he said to Mom. In the last week, when he thought she couldn't hear, he said he had spent 30 years in the wrong life, and he was sorry, but he wasn't sorry enough to have done anything differently. I don't know how to carry that. I don't know if it means he was honest at the end or just cruel." Marcus had responded, "He was both. He was always both. That's who he was." Daniel had written back, "I'm terrified of being him." Mara read that line 3 times. "I'm terrified of being him." And then she looked at what had happened in the year after his father's death. The year after Daniel had written that to his brother. The first year that Sylvie Martel's name appeared on a project credit at the firm. She sat very still for a long time. She was not ready to forgive him. She was not there, but she was beginning to understand something. the beginning of understanding, the first loosening of the tight, simple story of he betrayed me into something more complicated and therefore harder to carry. He was afraid of becoming his father, and in trying to outrun that fear, he walked directly into the same landscape. She wrote in the notebook, his father spent 30 years in the wrong life. Daniel spent 4 years in 2 lives. The fear didn't protect him. It just made him quieter about what he was doing. Then she wrote, he should have told me he was afraid. I would have helped him carry it. I have always helped him carry things. Then, after a long pause, she wrote, why didn't I ask him? Why did I assume that because I was carrying things quietly, he was fine? She stared at that last question. She didn't write an answer. She wasn't ready for the answer. March came in cold and then warmer, the ice on the lake releasing in a series of shifts and cracks that she could hear from the back porch in the mornings. She had finished her Harrow Lake reporting and was starting a new project, a coastal meadow, 3 hours south, and she found, as spring built, that she was sleeping better. Not because anything had been resolved, because she had stopped using her energy to pretend. She had been pretending for so long. Eleanor Birch had called in February, not about the lights, this time, but about the bird survey. She was doing her annual spring count and wondered if Mara wanted to walk the South Shore with her. Mara said yes. They walked on a Sunday morning, cold and bright. Perry asleep at home, Daniel in the city. Eleanor pointed out a pair of buffleheads that had returned for the 5th year running. They walked in a companionable quiet, and Mara felt, for the first time in months, that she was simply in a place she loved with a person she trusted. Near the end of the walk, Eleanor said, I know this isn't my business. Mara said, you can say it. Eleanor said, he hasn't been here in the mornings for 2 months. Not the early mornings. I still walk. I still see your house. Mara looked at the lake. I know, she said. Are you all right? Mara thought about the question. The honest answer was complicated. She said, I'm becoming something. I don't know what yet, but I think it's going to be better than what I was. Eleanor nodded, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to say. She was a woman who had watched a lake for 20 years. She knew about becoming. One more thing, Eleanor said. Last summer, late August, I saw her. Mara turned. A woman. Dark hair, shorter than you. She came in the morning, a Tuesday. I wrote it down. She had a camera. She photographed the restored section for about an hour. Then she walked to the dock. She stood at the end of the dock for a long time. Eleanor paused. She was crying. Mara was quiet. I thought she was just moved by the lake. Eleanor said, people sometimes are, but I thought you might want to know. In case it mattered. In case it mattered. Mara thought about a woman standing at the end of her dock, with a camera she'd used to photograph her work, crying in the early morning of a Tuesday in August while Daniel was in the city and Perry was at her grandmother's. She didn't know what to make of it. She wrote it in the notebook. She let it sit. She confronted him in April. Not because she was ready, not because she had a plan. She was ready in the way that you are ready when you have been holding a breath for 6 months and the holding has become harder than whatever comes next. He came home on a Thursday, the usual Thursday. Perry at a school event until 7, and Mara was at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, and the notebook closed in front of her, not open. She didn't need it open. She knew what was in it. He came in through the back door. He set his bag down. He looked at her, and he read the room. Because he was a man who read rooms, it had always been one of the things she loved about him. And his face changed. Not dramatically. A small shift in the set of his jaw. He went to the counter and poured water and turned around. She said, I know about Sylvie. He didn't move. She said, I know about the phone account, the 7 weekends, the photograph in the filing cabinet. Eleanor Birch, late August, Tuesday morning. He set the glass down, very carefully. He said, Mara? She said, how long? The pause was exactly the length of a man deciding whether to lie. She watched him decide. 4 years, he said. She had already known. Knowing hadn't prepared her. She pressed her hands flat on the table. Is it over? Another pause. Yes, since November. And then, before she could speak, I ended it. I knew I had known for months that I had to. He looked at her. I was going to tell you. You were going to tell me? She said. The voice came out very level. She had always been good with level. I was trying to find the way to. You were going to tell me, she said again. After you'd decided. After it was over. After you'd had 4 years. She looked at him. That's not telling me. That's managing me. He didn't argue. She saw, in his face, that he knew she was right. She said, why? He opened his mouth and she said, not the practical why, not the how it started, why? She held his gaze. What were you afraid of? He looked at the floor. When he looked up again, his face was different, the professional surface gone, the presentational certainty. She was looking at the version of him she'd seen through the kitchen window on early fishing mornings, except older and worse for something. My father, he said. She waited. He spent his whole life not having what he wanted. Daniel said, not choosing, just staying. Staying and being good, and not saying what he needed and then, at the end, blaming everyone around him for the life he'd built. I watched that. I watched it my whole childhood. I told myself I would never do that. He stopped. And then I did it anyway. Not the staying part. The other part. The not choosing. He looked at her. I don't think I knew I was afraid until it was already too late to do anything differently. Mara thought about the email. I'm terrified of being him. She said, you could have told me that. I know. 6 years ago? When he died. When you wrote that email to Marcus. You could have said to me, I'm carrying something. I would have listened. He looked at her and she saw it, the recognition. The understanding of exactly how much she would have carried for him without being asked. And in his face, she saw something she hadn't expected. A grief that was not about Sylvie Martel. A grief about something much older. You always carried everything, he said quietly. I didn't want to add to it. She was quiet for a very long time. That's the same thing, she said finally. Not telling me because you thought you'd burden me. That's the same thing I did. Managing, protecting, deciding on someone else's behalf what they can carry. He didn't answer. He was looking at her with the full attention that had been absent for so long that its return felt, absurdly, like a homecoming. I've been invisible in this marriage, she said. Not to you, to myself. I made myself invisible and called it love, and I never asked you to see me because I didn't think I needed to be seen. I thought the work was enough. She looked at the mason jar on the windowsill. It wasn't. He said, Mara. She said, I'm not forgiving you tonight. I don't know if I'm forgiving you at all. I need to think about what this is, what we are, whether there's anything left that I want to save. He nodded. She said, but I need you to know that I know all of it, the whole shape of it. I'm not going to carry it quietly for you. That's not what I'm doing anymore. He said, okay. I'm going to need you to hear me, she said, not manage me. Hear me. I hear you, he said. She didn't know if she believed him. She wrote it in the notebook. Later, April 17th. I told him. He didn't lie. That's either the beginning of something or the end of something, and I don't know which yet. The true shape of the shared wound took several more weeks to fully come into view. It came in a conversation with her sister in late April, Clara visiting from Boston for a long weekend. The two of them sitting on the back porch with wine while Perry slept inside and the lake was still and dark. Clara said, "Can I ask you something?" Mara said, "Yes." Why didn't you confront him sooner? You had enough in November. Mara thought about it. The honest answer had been forming in her for months. Because I was doing the same thing he was doing. I was managing, protecting, deciding I knew better than him about what he could handle and when. She turned her wine glass. He didn't tell me he was afraid because he didn't want to burden me. I didn't confront him because I wanted to be sure first, because I didn't trust my own perception. Because some part of me has spent my entire life not trusting that what I see is really what I see. Clara was quiet for a moment. Where does that come from, the not trusting? Mara looked at the lake. Mom, she said. She was sick for so long, and she spent all of it telling me she was fine. Every appointment, every test, every bad result. I'm fine, don't worry. She was protecting me. A pause. And I learned from her. I learned that the way you love someone is to absorb things quietly, to not say what you need, to make it look easy. She let out a breath. She died not having said most of what she felt. I held her hand, and I couldn't tell if she was at peace or just managing it to the end. Clara didn't say anything. I made the same choice, Mara said. Different context, same architecture. And Daniel made a different version of the same choice for different reasons. We were both running from something we inherited. We just ran in opposite directions and ended up in the same field. She picked up her wine. The lake was making its quiet sounds. The truth didn't need me to find it, she said. It was always going to come out. It just needed time. This is what I mean when I say she was already becoming someone new, even then. Even before she knew whether the marriage would survive. She was speaking the truth out loud instead of writing it in a notebook. She was naming what she needed instead of adjusting her needs to fit what she thought was possible. She was allowing herself to be witnessed. It was small. It was everything. The decision about the marriage took the rest of the spring. She spent it the way she spent her field seasons, methodically, carefully, and without false certainty about the outcome. She and Daniel had difficult conversations. Many of them. He was honest in a way he hadn't been in years. She gave him credit for that. He told her things she hadn't asked for, and she listened. And when she needed to, she said, "That's enough for tonight." She was learning to set the measure of things. She had always been good at measuring. They went to counseling. This was not her idea. It was his. She agreed not because she believed it would fix anything, but because she believed in evidence, and counseling was a way of gathering it, a way of watching, in a structured and witnessed space, what they were each capable of. The counselor was a quiet woman named Dr. Wren, who asked good questions and did not tell them what to feel. In the third session, she asked Mara, "What would it mean to you to stay?" Mara said, "It would mean choosing something I've never done. It would mean staying and being seen, not disappearing into the logistics, not managing, actually being in it." She paused. "I don't know if I know how to do that," Dr. Wren said. "What would it mean to go?" Mara said. "It would mean trusting myself." For the first time in a long time, she spent a long time after that session sitting in her car in the parking lot with the engine off, listening to the rain on the roof. She stayed, not out of inertia, not because of Perry, though Perry mattered enormously, not because it was the easier thing. It was not the easier thing. She stayed because she had looked at the full landscape of what they were, and she had decided that it was worth the harder work of restoration, not the passive kind. Not the adjusting quietly for everyone else kind, but the real kind. The kind that required removing what had colonized the space and waiting, in full view, to see what grew back. This was not forgiveness. She told him that. Forgiveness was a different season. What this was I am staying in this field, and I'm going to watch what happens when I stop making it easy. He said, "I can do harder." She said, "I know. I've watched you do hard things. That's not actually what I'm afraid of." "What are you afraid of?" She thought about it. That I'll go back to doing it quietly. That I'll slip back into the architecture I know. She looked at him. I'm going to need you to stop me if I do that. He said, I will. She almost said, how will I know if I should believe that? And then she said, I'll be watching. It was June when Perry found out. Not from Mara, not from Daniel. Perry found out the way 15-year-olds find out things their parents try to protect them from. She heard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear. On a Sunday morning when she came downstairs earlier than expected and stopped in the hallway. What she heard was not the worst of it, but it was enough. She came into the kitchen. She sat down. She looked at both of them. She said, Are you getting divorced? Daniel said. We don't know yet, Mara said. We're trying to figure out what we want, Perry said. You should have told me something was wrong. She was 15. She said it with the precision of someone who had been observing adults her whole life and had conclusions. Mara said, You're right. I'm sorry. Perry said, I'm not fragile, Mom. Mara said, I know. I think I've known that for a while, and I kept acting like I didn't. Perry looked at her for a long moment with Daniel's dark eyes. Then she said, Okay. And she got up and made herself toast and went back upstairs. The conversation was over. Mara sat at the kitchen table and felt, for the first time in 8 months, something approaching clean. Not happy, not resolved, but clean, as if a surface that had been covered had been cleared. She went to the back porch. The lake was high from the June rains, the restored corridor of native sedge visible from the house. New growth pushing up through the old, damaged sections with the quiet insistence of things that belong somewhere. She picked up her phone and called Clara. Clara answered on the second ring. Mara said, I told Perry, Clara said. How did she take it? Mara laughed a real laugh, sudden and small, the first in months. Better than I did. There is one more thing, the thing I said she needed time to understand. She went to the lake in early July, not the back shore, the south shore, Eleanor's shore, the walking path, early morning, before the heat. She walked the transect she knew by heart, checking the native species list she'd been monitoring since the restoration began. The sedge was thick and healthy. The buffleheads were still in residence. The soil, when she pressed her fingers into it at the water's edge, was dark and yielding and full. She stood at the end of the dock. She thought about a woman with dark hair and a camera standing in this exact spot in August, crying in the early morning. She thought about what it might mean to stand at someone else's dock and cry. She didn't know the whole story. She might never know it, but she thought about what Eleanor had said. She was crying, and she thought about Sylvie Martel's photograph of the restoration, the beautiful, technically accomplished photograph of a damaged place that had come back. She didn't think it excused anything. She didn't think Sylvie Martel was a victim. But she thought there was someone else in this story who was also not fully free. Someone else who had been standing at the edge of something she couldn't name, in a life that was not her own, photographing a testament to the possibility of restoration. The truth is never as simple as one person's fault. She had known that from her first field season. Ecosystems are not simple. Damage rarely has a single origin. Recovery is never as clean as the before and after photographs. She thought about her mother, about the 11 pages, about the notebook, which she hadn't needed to open in 2 months. She reached into her field bag and took out the small black river stone from the mason jar, the smooth one from the Oregon Creek bed, the first restoration project she'd ever led. The one that had taught her most of what she knew about how long recovery actually takes. She held it in her hand. She felt its weight. She set it down on the end of the dock, at the edge where the water lapped against the wood, and she left it there. She walked back along the south shore in the morning light. The lake was very still. The fog had not yet lifted. It was early. Too early. The sun just beginning to make its intentions known in the east. The fog moved the way it always moved, slow and low and patient, like something that had been waiting all night for permission. She watched it. She really looked. The truth does not need anyone to protect it. It only needs time. She had spent 44 years learning that silence and love were the same thing. She was done with that lesson. She was ready for the next one. Behind her, the house was starting to show lights. She walked home. This has been a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes of names, characters, businesses, places, and incidents are products of imagination and do not represent any real persons or events.